So guys, you've come up with a really interesting world here. Which, after the pilot, the one thing you just kind of you want to know more. So, is this a show that, I guess what we see in the pilot, is you're going to keep it this way for 5 to 7 years, or do you see a lot of twists and turns as far as the world we're seeing? I mean, right now we're seeing 2 worlds, and it looks like that's what the show will be. But can you talk about that a little bit as far as the longevity?
I think it's good to never make too many pronouncements about the longevity of TV is this tremendous act of faith in a way, unlike a novel, which is an act of faith too. But a movie, for instance, is shorter. You can see the end from the beginning, the time you set out. This is something that you have to sort of have a very good beginning, and you do it one step at a time, one episode at a time, one season at a time. But we think there's longevity here, yeah.
And I think that the 2 worlds that you reference, perhaps threatening longevity, I think is what we think is the key to it. It's really the fact that because he's distinctly chosen to live in both simultaneously, and they are going to begin to diverge and demand different things from him, the drama and conflict that comes from that, I think, is what makes it sustainable over a long period of time.
Now, how did you come up with the idea for the show?
He came up with it. I was a passenger.
I think coming off of my last show, Lone Star, there was a lot of, I don't want to call them unresolved issues, but there were, the idea of a character who lived in essentially 2 worlds and was loath to give up either one was something that we were in the business of actively exploring on that show, and was something I wanted to keep playing with. I think this just offered a different, more sort of unique and ultimately more supportable. I mean, it's not a guy with 2 wives. It's a guy who desperately wants to hold on to his wife and child. So it's something that I think a larger number of viewers have an easier time empathizing with.
Will there be times where Michael starts preferring one world over the other? Maybe because there's not as many challenges in one, and the other one might have really awful challenges. Is that definitely something we're going to see?
Definitely will see is always dangerous, but I think it's definitely something that we had discussed. In fact, from one of the first times that I met Howard, it was one of the things that intrigued him, the idea that the worlds weren't always perfectly symmetrical, and that things, and I think psychologically that makes sense, as things tend to go badly in one world, it makes sense that if you were dreaming the other, you might try to compensate by making it better, and vice versa. So playing with those sort of overlaps is something that we've been really interested in exploring.
Now, do you know which world is the real world? Have you decided?
No, we've actually been really careful to treat both as real. We share Britain's perspective that we make sure that the balance is always restored. I mean, we toy with what it would mean to push him in the direction of one or the other, seeming more real, but because ultimately his goal is to keep his wife and his son, he's always looking for a way to wrestle it back to equilibrium. And so we treat them both as he does, as if they're both completely real.
I'm always interested in what goes on in the writer's room, because I'm curious, since you have technically 2 worlds here, are you having writers who are only working on one world and the other, or does everybody kind of take a stab at both?
No, you end up really, the stories are so they're so woven together and interlocking, and they require each other, that it ends up being something that, as difficult as it is, you have to tackle as a whole. And it's sort of like putting together a Rubik's Cube. Everything you move has consequences for everything else. So while it seems really appealing to be able to split up the work, unfortunately you have to do it all together because everything affects everything else.
Now, kind of going off of this, can you talk a little bit about some of the elements that bleed through each of the worlds together? Is that something that will continue throughout every episode? I think before we were talking with a few of the actors, and they were mentioning that you could have, for example, one of the psychiatrists appearing from the red world to the green world, and mix them all together. And so I was curious if that's something that we can expect.
Yeah, I mean, in the way you see in the pilot, obviously he's working out his cases in his dreams. He doesn't know which is a dream and which isn't. So things he's interested in, stuck on, things he believes are important, tend to find a way to manifest themselves in both worlds and focus where he wants his investigation to go. But there are also personal and psychological things that he's wrestling with that also find a way to manifest themselves in both worlds and cross over. So we've toyed with all sorts of elements that some that seem genuinely dreamlike, almost hallucinatory, that he experiences in both worlds.
And Howard, with your experience in 24, how is this? I mean, what are some of the differences, I guess, in the storytelling? I mean, granted, they're very different shows, but are there things that you weren't expecting that are coming up? Or
yeah, I mean, the show has been a real learning process, and and there's been a fair amount of trial and error because it really defies a lot of the idea of a beginning, a middle, and end. I mean, 24 was fairly simple. There was a Jack Bauer trying to stop a bomb from going off, and we riffed on that very simple premise. Whereas this is a guy who has is living across two worlds. What does that mean? And the premise asks a lot of questions, and it's been interesting excavating for those answers. And as Kyle said, it is like a bit of a Rubik's Cube doing it. But I think the great rewarding part of it is finding the solution, is solving it, and really creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And how do you find a way to tell a story where the two worlds and the two stories actually inform one another reciprocally, emotionally, procedurally, mysteriously?
Now, if you had to pitch the show to people, what would you say to convince them to tune in?
Well, it's really, at its heart, it's a crime procedural, but it's about a detective who's solving crimes in a way that nobody else on television is doing or has ever done, across a real and a constructed universe, and blending them together to figure out where to go.
Can you go ahead?
I was just going to say, do you guys see it as a plus or a minus at your premiere mid-season? Is that a good thing? Or
I hope it's a plus.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's been an enormous blessing just, having the time to really work on everything so that it's not just as good as it can be before it airs next week, but as good as we can see to make it. I mean, that's been, especially for a show like this where, like Howard said, it's been a discovery how to put it together, just because there isn't anything else that works this way. So we're having to write the rule book along with the show, and
educate ourselves and the audience. I'm sorry.
No. So the extra time has been an enormous blessing on that front.
Television is like an accident. You have to just get incredibly lucky at every step along the way, and so many things have to go into making it right, and it only takes one thing to make it go wrong, and so time is absolutely an asset that we're lucky to have had. We could use even more.
Speaking of, taking the time, have things evolved from the pilot, or can you talk about how things evolved from the pilot to the new episodes you're shooting now?
I don't think we've changed where we're going, and I don't think that it's not like we've jettisoned any characters or anything of that nature, but we certainly, through, it's not even just the writing of the episodes, but producing them and putting them together and editing them and seeing what something looks like when it's down to 43 minutes, we've learned an incredible amount about what the show can do. So I think the things that we are producing now represent that gained knowledge that there wasn't any other way to get than to go make some episodes.
How challenging are the therapy scenes? Because these are things that we've seen all the time in TV, and there's a lot of information that comes out of them, but it's really two people talking. Is that a challenge to make sure that they're interesting? I mean, they definitely are in the pilot, but is that a challenge you're coming up against as you have those scenes?
Yeah, I think the challenge is taking the practical matter of having two wonderful actors in this part, and which serve a very specific function in the pilot, explaining the premise and how to evolve those characters, how to make them appear in stories in different capacities, and absolutely, it's an evolving challenge.
So we will see them more than just these two therapy sessions. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Speaking of actors, can you talk about the casting of the show? Because you have a really great cast.
Pretty amazing cast.
Yeah.
Well, we again, that's one of the things we got very, very lucky on. Starting with Jason, who is in that very, very small group of actors of a certain age, with a certain maturity and a lot of talent. and to get a male lead like that is a coup. And fortunately, he gravitated to the pilot as I did, and he's been terrific.